What if the perfect life you cherished was a lie? Imagine standing in a room gleaming with wealth, your hand resting on your pregnant belly only to see the family portrait you just posed for and you're not in it. Erased. Vanished as if you never existed. This isn't a nightmare. For Avery, this was the moment her world shattered. Her husband, the man who vowed to love her, delivered the coldest cut imaginable. But this isn't a story about a victim. It's about what she did next, an act of defiance so bold it would ignite a war right on his doorstep. The air in the Crestwood Manor's grand ballroom was thick with the scent of white roses and old money. It was the kind of suffocating fragrance Avery had grown accustomed to over her 5 years of marriage to Lennox Grayson. The Graysons weren't just wealthy, they were an institution in the insular world of New England's financial elite. Their family tree was rooted in colonial soil, its branches heavy with congressmen, shipping magnates, and investment bankers. To marry a Grayson was to be grafted onto this formidable oak. For Avery, a girl who had built her own successful art curation business from scratch, it had often felt more like being slowly strangled by its vines. Tonight was the annual Grayson family portrait, a tradition as sacred and unyielding as their Thanksgiving fox hunt. It was a pageant of power, a silent declaration of their dynastic permanence. The renowned portrait artist Anton Petrov had been flown in from St. Petersburg, his presence a testament to the family's influence. Avery stood beside Lennox, her hand instinctively resting on the gentle swell of her stomach. At 5 months pregnant, she was carrying the next Grayson heir, a fact that had until recently seemed to solidify her place within the family's hallowed halls. Lennox, impossibly handsome in his bespoke Brioni tuxedo, squeezed her hand. "Smile, darling," he murmured, his voice a low, smooth melody that once made her heart flutter, but now often carried a faint, unsettling dissonance. "Anton works magic, but even he can't fix a frown." She forced a smile, the gesture feeling alien on her face. Her gaze swept across the room. There was Lennox's mother, Victoria Grayson, the family's formidable matriarch. Dressed in a severe midnight blue gown, her silver hair coiled into an impeccable chignon, she watched the proceedings with the hawk-like intensity of a CEO overseeing a hostile takeover. She had never fully approved of Avery, viewing her self-made success not as a virtue but as a sign of an unsuitably independent spirit. Next to her stood Lennox's father, a quiet, faded man who had long ago ceded all authority to his wife. And then there was Lennox's younger sister, Amelia, whose nervous energy seemed to vibrate in the still oppressive air. The flash of Petrov's large-format camera was blinding. They held the pose, a perfect tableau of generational wealth and familial harmony. Lennox's hand on her back, Victoria's regal posture, the weight of the Grayson legacy pressing down on them all. It was a lie, of course, a beautiful, expensive, expertly crafted lie. Later, as guests mingled sipping vintage champagne and nibbling on canapés that cost more than most people's weekly groceries, a hush fell over the room. Petrov, with a theatrical flourish, was unveiling the finished portrait. It wasn't a photograph. He used a cutting-edge digital medium that allowed for instantaneous hyper-realistic rendering, which was then projected onto a large screen for the family's approval before being sent for printing on archival canvas. "A masterpiece, Anton, as always," Victoria declared, her voice ringing with satisfaction. A wave of applause rippled through the gathered family members and their sycophantic inner circle. Lennox pulled Avery closer, his arm possessive around her shoulders. "See, perfect," he whispered in her ear. Avery's eyes scanned the projected image. There was the ornate fireplace, the Persian rug worth a small fortune, the self-satisfied glint in Victoria's eyes. There was Lennox looking every bit the proud scion. There were his father and sister. But where she should have been standing, hand on her pregnant belly, there was only an empty space. A seamless, artful void. They hadn't just removed her. They had digitally altered the background, filling the space with the pattern of the damask wallpaper behind her. She had been erased. A cold, sharp wave of nausea entirely unrelated to her pregnancy washed over her. Her breath hitched. It couldn't be. A mistake. A technical glitch. She turned to Lennox, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Lennox," she whispered, her voice trembling. I'm not in it." Lennox didn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on the screen, a chillingly placid smile on his lips. "It's a portrait of the Grayson bloodline, Avery," he said, his tone matter-of-fact, as if explaining a simple, unchangeable truth. "The family." The blood drained from her face. "The family, Lennox. I'm your wife. I'm carrying your son." Her voice rose, attracting the attention of those nearby. Victoria glided to her son's side, her eyes two chips of ice. "Lower your voice, dear. One shouldn't air their misunderstandings in public." "Misunderstanding?" Avery felt a hysterical laugh bubble in her throat. "You've cut me out of the family portrait. You've literally erased me. How is that a misunderstanding?" Lennox finally turned to her. His blue eyes, once the color of a summer sky, now looked like a frozen lake. "Mother felt and I agree that the portrait should be about permanence, legacy. You and we've been having our difficulties. It seemed prudent." Difficulties. He called their growing chasm difficulties. He called his nightly absences, his secretive phone calls, his cold indifference to her pregnancy, difficulties. And his solution, his mother's solution, was to delete her. To render her, and by extension their unborn child, invisible. The room began to spin. The scent of roses was now cloying, suffocating. The hushed whispers of the guests felt like tiny daggers against her skin. She looked from Lennox's impassive face to Victoria's triumphant smirk and understood. This wasn't a negotiation. It was a verdict. She had been tried, judged, and found unworthy of the Grayson name. With a strength she didn't know she possessed, she pulled away from Lennox's grasp. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. A terrifying, preternatural calm settled over her. She met Victoria's gaze, then Lennox's. "I see," she said, her voice quiet but ringing with a finality that cut through the ballroom's strained silence. "Thank you for the clarification." Without another word, she turned and walked away. Not out the front door, not yet. She walked through the sea of stunned faces, her back straight, her head held high. She ascended the grand sweeping staircase, each step an act of defiance. In their opulent bedroom, the one she would never sleep in again, she packed a single bag. Her laptop, her personal documents, and a small velvet box containing the jewelry her own grandmother had left her. She left the Grayson diamonds, the tennis bracelets, the anniversary gifts all scattered on the dresser like discarded tokens from a game she was no longer playing. As she walked out of Crestwood Manor, the cool night air felt like a balm on her burning skin. She didn't look back. The life she had tried so hard to fit into the love she thought she had, it had all been an illusion as ephemeral as her image on that screen. They thought they had erased her. They had no idea they had just set her free. And as she got into her car, a plan wild and audacious began to form in the ruins of her heart. It started with a single burning thought. "You want to erase me? I'll become the one thing you can never ignore." The drive away from Crestwood Manor was a blur of manicured lawns and towering oak trees lining the most exclusive road in Greenwich, Connecticut. Avery's hands were slick on the leather steering wheel of her Tesla, a birthday gift from Lennox last year. A hollow, aching grief warred with a white-hot, electrifying rage inside her. It was the rage that won. It burned away the tears before they could form, forging something harder and more resilient in their place. She didn't drive to a hotel or to a friend's apartment in the city. Her mind was a whirlwind of calculations, a frantic inventory of her own resources. Before Lennox, she had been Avery Wynn, founder of Wynn Art Advisory, a boutique firm that had brokered multi-million-dollar deals for private collectors and museums. She had poured her soul into that business, and it had thrived. When she married Lennox, Victoria had gently but firmly insisted she step back. "A Grayson wife doesn't work, dear. She manages the household and focuses on philanthropy." She had said the statement laced with the sweet poison of condescension. Avery had acquiesced, wanting to prove she could be the wife they wanted. She sold a majority stake in her company, but in a rare moment of foresight, she now thanked God for she had not sold it all. She retained a 20% silent partnership. More importantly, against the advice of the Grayson family's army of financial advisors who wanted to merge all her assets into Lennox's labyrinthine trusts, she had insisted on keeping a separate investment portfolio managed by her own broker, a shrewd woman named Sarah Chen. This portfolio was her rainy day fund, a secret rebellion against the gilded cage she had willingly walked into. Tonight the heavens had opened and a hurricane was brewing. She pulled over onto a quiet, tree-lined street, the grand gates of the various estates looming like silent sentinels in the darkness. She took a deep, shuddering breath and pulled out her phone. Her fingers flew across the screen, logging into her secure banking portal. The numbers that glowed back at her were staggering. Years of savvy investments, compounded returns, and dividends from her old company had swelled the account to a figure that would shock even the Graysons. It was her money. Untouchable. Unseen by them. A war chest they never knew existed. A raw, powerful laugh escaped her lips. They thought she was a decorative bird trapped in their cage. They had no idea she had been quietly building her own wings. Her eyes scanned the street signs, and a jolt went through her. She was on Highcliffe Road, the very same road as Crestwood Manor. And then she saw it. Set back from the road, partially obscured by overgrown wisteria and melancholy-looking willow trees, was the old Hemlock House. It was a magnificent, if neglected, Gilded Age mansion that sat directly adjacent to the Grayson estate, separated only by a low stone wall and a thick stand of ancient birch trees. Avery knew the house. It had been on the market for over a year, owned by an elderly couple, the Delacourts, who had finally moved to a warmer climate. It was considered a white elephant, too large, too dated for modern tastes, and rumored to have structural issues. Victoria had often commented on it with disdain, calling it a dreadful eyesore, and expressing her hope that some developer would tear it down and build something tasteful. A slow, dangerous smile spread across Avery's face. The idea, born of pure, unadulterated defiance, took root and blossomed in an instant. It was insane. It was impulsive. It was perfect. Her fingers were already dialing. Sarah Chen, a crisp voice answered despite the late hour. "Sarah, it's Avery Grayson." "Well, Avery Wynn now." There was a brief pause. "Avery, is everything all right? It's past midnight in New York. Everything is finally crystal clear." Avery said, her voice steady. "I need you to do something for me. Right now, I need to buy a house." "Okay," Sarah said slowly, the surprise evident in her tone. "Do you have a property in mind?" "I do. The old Delacourt property. 142 Highcliffe Road, Greenwich." This time the silence on the other end of the line was longer. "The Hemlock House, Avery, that place is a fortress. It's been on the market forever. Are you sure, 100% certain? I want to make a cash offer. Full asking price. No 20% over asking. I want it to be an offer they can't possibly refuse. I want to close on it by sunrise." By sunrise," Sarah sputtered. "Avery, that's impossible. There are inspections, title searches, contracts." "Waive the inspections." Avery cut her off, her voice ringing with newfound authority. "I'll take the risk. As for the contracts, I'm sending you the listing now. Find the seller's agent. Tell them they have a non-contingent all-cash offer that's significantly over their asking price, but it expires at 6 a.m. Tell them my lawyer will wire the full amount to an escrow account within the hour. Get it done, Sarah." "This is highly irregular," Sarah said, but Avery could hear the thrill of the challenge in her voice. Sarah Chen hadn't gotten to the top of her field by shying away from a fight, and highly aggressive. "What's going on?" Avery looked back in the direction of Crestwood Manor, its lights blazing against the dark sky. "Let's just say I'm entering into a new phase of real estate investment," she said. "I'm investing in proximity." For the next 4 hours, Avery sat in her car, the engine off the world silent except for the frantic buzz of activity happening through her phone. Sarah Chen, true to her reputation, worked miracles. She tracked down the Delacourte's sleepy agent in Palm Beach, rousing him from his bed. The agent, initially skeptical, became considerably more enthusiastic when he heard the offer. He woke the Delacourtes, who upon hearing the words "all cash and 20% over ask," were practically weeping with joy. Lawyers were woken up. Documents were drawn up and e-signed. And using a series of emergency wire transfers that cost a small fortune in fees, Avery drained a massive portion of her portfolio. By 5:30 a.m., as the first pale fingers of dawn began to streak the sky, her phone buzzed with an email from Sarah. The subject line was simple: "Congratulations." Attached was a digitally executed purchase and sale agreement. The Hemlock House was hers. Avery started the car and drove slowly, pulling not into the long, winding driveway of Crestwood Manor, but into the adjacent weed-choked drive of 142 Highcliffe Road. The house loomed before her, dark and imposing, its windows like vacant eyes. It was a Gothic masterpiece of granite and slate, a sleeping giant waiting to be woken. She got out of the car, the deed to the house, a digital file on her phone, feeling heavier and more real than any diamond Lennox had ever given her. The air was cool and damp, carrying the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. She walked across the overgrown lawn until she reached the old stone wall that separated her new property from the one she had just fled. Across the pristine, unnaturally green expanse of the Grayson estate, the lights of Crestwood Manor were still on. She could imagine the scene inside. The last of the guests departing, the staff clearing away the champagne flutes. Lennox and his mother triumphant, believing they had won. Believing they had silenced her, erased her, banished her from their perfect world. Avery leaned against the cold stone, a feeling of profound, almost giddy power surging through her. They had taken her portrait off the wall, so she had bought the gallery next door. They wanted to pretend she didn't exist. Soon her existence would be the first thing they saw when they woke up in the morning and the last thing they saw at night. This wasn't just a house. It was a declaration of war. And she, Avery Wynne, their pregnant, erased wife, was now their new neighbor. The ghost they thought they'd exorcised had just bought the haunted house next door, and she was ready to begin her haunting. The sun was casting long, golden fingers across the manicured lawns of Highcliffe Road when the first signs of life emerged from Crestwood Manor. A state-of-the-art automated sprinkler system hissed to life, misting the prize-winning roses that were Victoria Grayson's pride and joy. Shortly after, a sleek black Range Rover crunched down the gravel driveway. Lennox, looking weary but resolute, was heading to the city for a day of commanding the financial world. He likely hadn't even noticed Avery's side of the bed was cold. He probably assumed she was sleeping in one of the manor's many guest rooms, sulking. Avery watched him go from behind the dusty, mullioned window of her new living room. The house smelled of dust, disuse, and a faint, lingering scent of potpourri, a ghostly memory of the Delacourtes. She hadn't slept. Adrenaline and a potent brew of grief and fury were a powerful stimulant. She had spent the pre-dawn hours exploring her new domain. The Hemlock House was a labyrinth of forgotten splendor. There were cavernous rooms with 12-foot ceilings, floors inlaid with intricate marquetry, and fireplaces large enough to stand in. But it was also a monument to decay. Plaster was crumbling, wallpaper was peeling in damp patches, and a fine layer of dust coated everything like a shroud. In one of the upstairs bedrooms, a rook had built a nest in a gap in the window frame. This wasn't a house. It was a project. A glorious, defiant, all-consuming project. Her first calls were not to decorators or designers, but to a different kind of army. By 8 a.m., a fleet of unassuming white vans began to arrive. Not construction trucks, but discreet vehicles belonging to a high-end security firm, a team of structural engineers, and an environmental assessment crew. The men and women who emerged were quiet, professional, and expensive. Avery had instructed them to be thorough and above all to be fast. She wanted a full workup of the house's bones, its weaknesses, and its potential, and she wanted it by sundown. The real show, however, was scheduled for 9:15 a.m. Victoria Grayson's morning routine was as predictable as the tides. At 9 a.m., she would take her breakfast a single poached egg, half a grapefruit, and black coffee on the east-facing terrace, which offered a perfect sweeping view of her gardens and, incidentally, a clear line of sight to the dilapidated Hemlock house next door. Avery stood on her own crumbling stone terrace, a mug of tea warming her hands, and waited. She was dressed not in her usual bespoke casual wear, but in practical jeans, sturdy boots, and a simple black sweater. She wanted the Graysons to see her, but not as the woman they thought they knew. At precisely 9:14, Victoria emerged onto her terrace, a cashmere throw draped over her shoulders. She settled into her wrought iron chair, unfolded her copy of the Wall Street Journal, and signaled for the maid to pour her coffee. Her eyes, as always, flicked momentarily toward the neighboring property, her expression one of habitual distaste. And then she froze. Her hand holding the silver coffee pot paused mid-air. Her gaze locked onto the figure standing on the overgrown terrace next door. Avery. Avery didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply met Victoria's stare across the 100 yards of pristine lawn and held it. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her tea. Victoria's face was a mask of disbelief which quickly curdled into confusion and then into pure, unadulterated rage. She stood up so abruptly that her chair screeched against the flagstones. She squinted as if her eyes were deceiving her. But there was no mistaking the defiant set of Avery's shoulders or the clear, unmistakable swell of her pregnant belly. Just then, a massive truck far larger and louder than the discreet vans rumbled up the driveway of the Hemlock house. It bore the logo of a company called Greenwood Arborists. 3 men in hard hats and bright orange vests hopped out carrying chainsaws. Victoria watched aghast as Avery gestured toward a thick, ancient stand of birch trees, the very trees that formed the natural, elegant privacy screen between the two properties. One of the men pulled the cord on his chainsaw, and the morning quiet was shattered by a ferocious, snarling roar. That was all it took. Victoria spun around and stormed back into her house, the glass door slamming behind her. 2 minutes later, her son Lennox's car came speeding back up the driveway, skidding to a halt. He must have been halfway to the highway when his mother called her voice, no doubt a shriek of apoplectic fury. Lennox burst out of the car, his tie already loosened, his face a thundercloud. He didn't bother with the gate. He vaulted over the low stone wall with an athletic grace that surprised Avery and stalked across the overgrown lawn toward her. "What in God's name do you think you're doing?" he yelled, his voice raw with a fury she had never seen him direct at her before. "Good morning, Lennox," Avery said calmly. "I'm consulting with an arborist. This birch grove is lovely, but it's blocking the morning sun from my house. I'm thinking of replacing it with a fence, something tall, perhaps with barbed wire. What do you think? Would that be tasteful enough for the neighborhood?" Lennox stopped dead, his chest heaving. He stared at her, then at the house, then back at her. The cogs were turning, but the conclusion was so outlandish, so impossible, that his mind couldn't seem to grasp it. "Your house? What are you talking about? Did you break in here? Avery, this isn't a game. Go home." "I am home," she said, delivering the line with quiet satisfaction. She held up her phone, displaying the email with the signed deed. "I bought it, this morning, all cash. I believe that makes us neighbors." The color drained from Lennox's face. He looked as if she had physically struck him. He snatched the phone from her hand, his eyes scanning the document. He read it once, then twice, his jaw tightening with every word. "You can't do this." He whispered the words, a mixture of threat and disbelief. "I just did," she replied, taking her phone back. "You and your mother wanted to erase me. You wanted me gone. Well, I'm gone from your house. But I'm not gone from your life. In fact, you'll find I'm closer than ever. Every time you look out your window, every time you step onto your perfect terrace, you'll see me. You'll see this house. You'll see your son or daughter growing up right next door, a constant reminder of the family you tried to throw away. The roar of the chainsaw started up again, a brutal punctuation to her declaration. From across the lawn, Victoria had reappeared on her terrace, her face pale with fury. She was screaming something, but the noise of the chainsaw drowned it out. "This is war, Avery." Lennox hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you've just started. We will bury you. We will take this house. We will take your money. And when that baby is born, we will prove you're an unfit mother, and we will take him too." A chill went down Avery's spine, but she didn't let it show. She had expected a fight, but the speed and viciousness of his threat were startling. This was the real Lennox Grayson, stripped of his polished charm. This was the man who would erase his pregnant wife without a second thought. "Try it," she said, her voice laced with steel. "You think your money and your name are your greatest weapons. You're wrong. Your greatest weakness is your arrogance. You never saw me coming, and you have no idea what I'm capable of now that I have nothing left to lose." She turned her back on him, a clear dismissal, and walked toward the head arborist. "Take them down," she said, her voice loud enough for Lennox to hear over the din. "Take them all down." As the first majestic birch tree began to groan and splinter, crashing to the ground with a shudder that seemed to shake the very earth, Avery felt a profound sense of victory. The screen was gone. The view between the two houses was now stark open and unavoidable. The war had begun, and she had just fired the first deafening shot. The days that followed the felling of the birch grove were a masterclass in psychological warfare. Highcliffe Road, once a bastion of discreet old-world tranquility, became a theater of open conflict. The Graysons, accustomed to wielding their power like a cudgel in the velvet-lined boardrooms of Manhattan, were discovering that a battle for one's own backyard was a different, more visceral kind of fight. Lennox, true to his word, unleashed his legal hounds. Cease and desist letters began arriving daily, delivered by stone-faced couriers. They were masterpieces of legalese, accusing Avery of everything from violating obscure neighborhood zoning ordinances to creating a public nuisance. They threatened injunctions to halt all work on the Hemlock House, citing potential damage to the historical aesthetic of the community, a community the Graysons had just welcomed her into by trying to render her invisible. Avery had anticipated this. Her lawyer, a sharp, tenacious woman named Lena Petrova, who had made a name for herself defending artists against corporate behemoths, met their every move with a calm, surgical precision. For every letter Lennox's firm sent, Lena sent two back, citing Avery's property rights, producing permits that had been miraculously expedited by the town council, thanks to a generous and anonymous donation to the town's park revitalization fund, and subtly reminding the Graysons' lawyers that a public court battle involving the shunning of a pregnant wife would make for spectacular tabloid fodder, something that could tarnish even a name as established as Grayson. Meanwhile, Avery's army of workers descended upon the Hemlock House. But it wasn't the chaotic, noisy demolition the Graysons might have expected. It was a quiet, ruthlessly efficient occupation. Giant privacy screens 20 feet high and covered in a neutral gray fabric were erected along the entire property line, blocking the view far more effectively than the birch trees ever had. The message was clear. "You don't get to look at me, but I can still see you." From the upper floors of her new home, Avery had a panoramic view of every coming and going at Crestwood Manor. She had effectively built her own observation tower. Behind these screens, the house was being transformed. The structural engineers had, as suspected, found issues. The foundation needed reinforcement, the wiring was a fire hazard, and the plumbing was archaic. To the Graysons, this would have been a disaster. To Avery, it was an opportunity. She wasn't just renovating, she was fortifying. She poured money into creating a modern fortress complete with a state-of-the-art security system, independent power generators, and a water filtration system that could run for a month off-grid. She was preparing for a siege. The social attacks were more insidious. Victoria Grayson, the undisputed queen of Greenwich society, began her campaign. Invitations to charity luncheons and gallery openings that were once addressed to Mr. and Mrs. Lennox Grayson now arrived addressed only to Lennox. Friends who had once gushed over Avery's impeccable taste now averted their eyes when they saw her at the local organic market. Whispers followed her down the aisles, a trail of carefully curated rumors. She was unstable, emotionally volatile, having a breakdown. They were painting her as the hysterical woman, a classic and vicious tactic. One afternoon, Avery ran into Amelia Lennox's sister at a small bookstore in town. Amelia looked pale and nervous, clutching a book of poetry to her chest. "Avery," she stammered, her eyes darting around as if expecting her mother to materialize from behind a bookshelf. I'm so sorry. About everything." "Are you?" Avery asked, her tone not unkind. She had always felt a sliver of pity for Amelia, who lived in the suffocating shadow of her mother and brother. "What they did, it was monstrous," Amelia whispered, her voice trembling. "Lennox isn't himself. Mother has him so twisted up." "She didn't twist his arm to erase me, Amelia. He did that all on his own," Avery said coolly. Amelia flinched. "I know, but he's under so much pressure, especially with the Vanderbilt deal." Avery's ears perked up. The Vanderbilts were old rivals of the Graysons, a family with even older money and a competing investment empire. "What Vanderbilt deal?" "I've said too much," Amelia said, panicking. "Please just be careful, Avery. They're not going to stop." She scurried away, leaving Avery standing in the aisle, a new piece of the puzzle clicking into place. The pressure Lennox was under, the sudden desperate need to present a perfect, unblemished family image. It wasn't just about legacy, it was about money. A massive deal was on the line, and any hint of scandal, like a messy public divorce, could jeopardize it. The erasure from the portrait hadn't just been an act of personal cruelty. It had been a cold, calculated business decision. Her existence had become a liability. This new knowledge hardened her resolve. Her fight was no longer just about personal justice. It was about survival. Her counteroffensive was subtle but devastating. She started by hosting a small exclusive gathering. The guest list was a strategic masterpiece. It didn't include the fickle socialites Victoria controlled. Instead, Avery invited the people they couldn't afford to offend: influential art critics from New York, the director of the MoMA, and a handful of powerful self-made female executives who had little patience for the stuffy, patriarchal world of the Graysons. The main event was a private showing of her latest acquisition, a stunning, newly discovered painting by a forgotten female artist from the Hudson River School. The party was a resounding success. Word spread like wildfire. The story was intoxicating, the brilliant Avery Wynne emerging from her gilded cage, reclaiming her identity, and single-handedly reviving the legacy of a lost female artist, all from her mysterious work-in-progress mansion. She wasn't the hysterical wife. She was a patron, a visionary, a phoenix rising. She was controlling the narrative, and it was driving Victoria mad. One evening, as Avery was reviewing blueprints in her new makeshift office, a room that overlooked the Graysons' perfectly illuminated swimming pool, a light flickered in Lennox's study. It was late, well past midnight. She picked up a pair of high-powered binoculars she'd bought for bird watching. She watched as Lennox paced back and forth, a phone pressed to his ear. He looked stressed, exhausted and angry. He ran his hands through his hair, his perfect facade cracking under the strain. He was losing. On the legal front, on the social front, and she suspected on the business front. Then she saw him stop and look directly across the lawn toward her house. Even from this distance, she could feel the intensity of his gaze. It wasn't the look of a man who missed his wife. It was the look of a king surveying a rival fortress that had unexpectedly appeared at his borders, a fortress that was proving to be impenetrable. She lowered the binoculars, a grim satisfaction settling over her. The battle lines were drawn. The houses were their trenches. They thought their money, their name, and their cruelty would be enough to break her. But Avery Wynne was discovering that a woman with nothing to lose, a brilliant mind, and a righteous cause was a far more formidable opponent than they had ever imagined. The siege of Highcliffe Road had just begun. The autumn chill began to settle over Greenwich, stripping the trees of their leaves and exposing the stark, skeletal branches beneath. The view between the two houses became even more pronounced, a constant, unavoidable reminder of the war of attrition being waged. The privacy screens around Avery's property, now nicknamed the Great Wall of Greenwich by the local gossip mill, only served to heighten the mystery and fuel speculation. Lennox's attacks grew more desperate. One morning, Avery woke to find a team of surveyors on her property accompanied by 2 police officers. Lennox had filed an emergency petition claiming a discrepancy in the original property lines, asserting that her new security fence encroached on Grayson land by 3 inches. It was a petty, harassing maneuver designed to drain her resources and her spirit. Avery, however, was prepared. Lena Petrova arrived within minutes, armed with certified surveys dating back to the 19th century. The original deed for the Hemlock House. It turned out included a small, forgotten parcel of land that jutted into what the Graysons had always considered their back lawn. Not only was Avery's fence not encroaching on their property, but the Graysons' prized multi-tiered rose garden, Victoria's Sanctuary, was in fact partially planted on Avery's land. The scene on the lawn was a spectacle of quiet humiliation. The surveyors, after retaking their measurements, conferred in hushed tones before sheepishly informing the police officers that Mrs. Wynne was correct. Victoria, who had been watching from her terrace with an air of smug certainty, turned a shade of pale that matched her white roses. Avery had the legal right to demand the removal of a significant portion of her mother-in-law's most cherished creation. She didn't, of course. Not yet. She simply instructed Lena to send a formal letter to the Graysons granting them temporary permission to continue trespassing on her land for the purpose of gardening, a permission that could be revoked at any time. The move was a masterpiece of psychological dominance, an act of magnanimity that was in reality a reminder of who held all the power. But this small victory was overshadowed by a growing personal anxiety. The pregnancy, which had been her secret wellspring of strength, was becoming more physically demanding. There were days she felt exhausted, vulnerable, and terribly alone within the cavernous, half-finished rooms of her fortress. The constant stress was taking its toll, and she worried about the baby. It was in these quiet, lonely moments that the rage would subside, leaving behind the deep, aching grief of her betrayal. She would rest a hand on her belly, whispering promises to the tiny life within, that she would build them a safe, happy world far from the toxicity of the house next door. One evening, Lennox appeared at her gate. He was alone without lawyers or police. He looked tired and defeated. "Avery, can we please just talk?" he said through the intercom, his voice stripped of its usual arrogance. Her first instinct was to say no. But curiosity and a faint traitorous echo of the man she thought she had married made her pause. She buzzed him in, but met him on the front steps, not inviting him inside. The towering scaffold-clad house loomed behind her like a loyal bodyguard. "This has gone on long enough," he began, his eyes scanning the chaos of construction. "This is insane. My mother is a wreck. Our friends are choosing sides. This whole thing with the Vanderbilts is about to implode because they see us as unstable." "A problem of your own making," Avery said, her voice devoid of warmth. "You could have just given me a quiet divorce, Lennox. But you and your mother had to be cruel. You had to annihilate me. This," she gestured to the house, "this is the consequence of that choice." He took a step closer. "I know. I was wrong. I was listening to my mother and I let her influence me. I never wanted to hurt you, Avery." The words were what she once would have longed to hear, but now they sounded hollow, rehearsed. She saw not a repentant husband, but a man trying to plug a hole in his sinking ship. "You're not sorry you hurt me," she said, her voice cutting through the evening air. "You're sorry I didn't break. You're sorry I fought back. And you're terrified that my fighting back is going to cost you the Vanderbilt deal." He flinched his eyes, telling her she had hit the mark. "That's not true." He lied, but the conviction was gone. I miss you. I miss us. The house is empty without you. The house is empty because you filled it with secrets, Lennox, she shot back, and then she decided to deploy a piece of ammunition she had been holding in reserve. I had a very interesting conversation with an old friend of ours the other day, Michael Sterling. Lennox's face went rigid. Michael Sterling was an art dealer who had worked with Avery years ago. He was also a notorious gossip. Michael was telling me about a very specific piece he sold last year. Avery continued watching Lennox's reaction carefully. A Degas sculpture, Petite Danseuse de 14 ans, a rare bronze cast. He sold it to a private anonymous buyer for an obscene amount of money. A buyer who Michael mentioned used a shell corporation based in the Cayman Islands. A shell corporation that my lawyers, after a little digging, found is secretly controlled by Grayson Investments. She saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. She was bluffing mostly. Her lawyers hadn't found definitive proof, but they had found whispers enough to spin a convincing tale. That's a beautiful piece to add to a collection, she said softly. But it's a strange one for you, Lennox. You always said you found the Impressionists too sentimental. So I started to wonder who you might have bought it for. It would have to be someone very special, someone who loves Degas, someone perhaps like Alana Vanderbilt. Lennox paled. Alana Vanderbilt was the fiery, intelligent daughter of the Vanderbilt patriarch, the one driving the negotiations for the merger. I don't know what you're talking about, he stammered. Don't you? Avery pressed, stepping closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. The secret trips to Paris. The business dinners that lasted until 2 a.m. The reason you needed your wife, your pregnant wife, to become invisible. It wasn't just about presenting a stable image for the deal, was it? It was about clearing the stage for your next leading lady. You didn't just erase me from a portrait, Lennox. You were trying to erase me from your life to make room for hers. The truth of it hung in the air between them, stark and ugly. His silence was a confession. The betrayal was deeper, colder, and more calculated than she had ever imagined. The portrait, the cruelty, the lies, it had all been a prelude to her replacement. A single hot tear of pure rage and heartbreak finally escaped and traced a path down her cheek. She wiped it away angrily. "Get off my property," she said, her voice trembling with a fury that felt seismic. "Avery, let me explain. Get out!" she screamed, the sound echoing in the cavernous, unfinished space behind her. "You come here again, and I will not only tear down your mother's precious roses, I will send a full dossier of my suspicions about you, Alana Vanderbilt, and your fraudulent use of company funds to her father personally. Now get out of my sight." Lennox stared at her. His mask of contrition shattered, revealing the cornered animal beneath. He saw then that there was no path to reconciliation, no way to charm or bully his way back into control. He had created his own worst enemy. He turned without another word and walked away. His shoulders slumped, not in sadness, but in the grim recognition of a battle he was now in danger of losing completely. Avery stood on the steps until his car disappeared down the road. The unraveling had begun. It wasn't just their marriage that was coming apart. It was his carefully constructed empire of lies. And she was the one holding the thread. The annual Patrons of the Arts Gala was the glittering apex of the Greenwich social calendar, held at the local museum. A museum that housed a wing named after the Grayson family. It was a night of breathtaking gowns, 7-figure donations, and brutal unspoken power plays. For years, Avery had stood by Lennox's side at this event, a beautiful, smiling accessory. This year she would be attending alone. Her arrival caused an immediate, palpable stir. The whispers followed her like the train of her gown, a stunning, custom-made creation in a deep emerald green that hugged her pregnant figure, not with apology, but with pride. She looked radiant, powerful, and utterly serene. She navigated the crowded ballroom with a grace that belied the turmoil of the past few months, greeting the few allies she'd cultivated and coolly ignoring the sycophants who now pretended not to see her. she saw the Graysons holding court near the grand staircase. Victoria was a vision in icy silver, her face a mask of regal displeasure as she watched Avery move through the room. Lennox stood beside her, looking tense and distracted, his eyes constantly scanning the crowd. He was looking for one person, Alana Vanderbilt. And Avery knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that tonight was the night the merger was to be unofficially celebrated. Avery had a different celebration in mind. She had spent the last several weeks not just fortifying her house, but building her case. Her lawyers, spurred on by the Degas sculpture lead, had partnered with a team of forensic accountants. They had burrowed deep into the labyrinth of Grayson Investments' public filings and offshore dealings. What they found was a pattern of behavior, Lennox using opaque shell corporations to move company funds for personal use. The sculpture was just the most flagrant example. There were also lavish trips, undocumented consulting fees paid to mysterious entities, and a clear traceable line of money being siphoned away from shareholders and into his private orbit. It wasn't just immoral, it was illegal. Her plan for the evening was simple and devastating. The gala always featured a keynote address followed by the presentation of the Patron of the Year award. This year, the recipient was unsurprisingly Victoria Grayson for her lifelong dedication to the arts. She would be expected to give a speech. Avery positioned herself near a powerful group of people, the museum's board of directors, a journalist from the New York Times arts section she knew personally, and most importantly, Harrison Vanderbilt, Alana's formidable father. He was a shrewd old-school tycoon with a reputation for zero tolerance for scandal. As the ceremony began, Lennox and Victoria took their places at the head table, looking for all the world like the royal family of Greenwich. When Victoria was called to the stage to accept her award, she was the picture of grace and humility. She approached the podium, the room silent with rapt attention. "I am so deeply honored," she began, her voice smooth and practiced. "Art is the lifeblood of a community. It is the legacy we leave behind. It is about truth, beauty, and integrity. These are the values our family has always striven to uphold." At that exact moment, every phone in the room buzzed. A single simultaneous email had been sent from a secure anonymous server. The recipient list was a carefully curated who's who of the financial and art worlds, including every person in that ballroom. The subject line read, "A question of integrity, the Grayson family's other collection." The email was short, professional, and brutal. It laid out in clear, concise language the findings of the forensic accountants. It detailed the shell corporations, the misappropriated funds, and the purchase of the Degas sculpture. It didn't mention Alana Vanderbilt by name. It didn't have to. It simply posed the question, who was the secret beneficiary of the Grayson heirs' illicit generosity? The email included scanned copies of key financial documents, a money trail that was undeniable. A low murmur rippled through the room. People were looking down at their phones, their eyes widening in shock and fascination. On stage, Victoria, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere, faltered. Her smile wavered. Lennox at the head table had gone white as a sheet. His eyes darted around the room and landed on Avery. She was standing perfectly still, her expression calm, her gaze level. She gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod. A final checkmate. Harrison Vanderbilt, standing not 10 feet from Avery, was reading the email on his phone, his face growing darker with every sentence. He looked up, his cold, piercing gaze sweeping past Lennox to his daughter Alana, who was trying to shrink into the shadows. Then he looked at Avery. He saw not a hysterical ex-wife, but a woman who had just handed him all the leverage he would ever need. The murmur in the room grew louder. Victoria, completely flustered, stammered through the end of her speech and practically fled the stage. The applause was scattered, distracted. The spell was broken. The Grayson dynasty in the space of a single email had been exposed as a sham. The gala dissolved into chaos. People were huddled in small groups, whispering furiously. The journalist from the Times was already on the phone with her editor. Harrison Vanderbilt walked calmly over to his daughter, said 2 words to her, and she and her entourage immediately headed for the exit. The Vanderbilt deal was dead. Lennox remained frozen at his table, a man watching his entire world burn down around him. Victoria rushed to his side, her face a mask of fury and panic. "This is her!" she hissed loud enough for those nearby to hear. "That ungrateful little viper, she did this!" "Yes," a calm voice said. Avery had walked over to their table. She stood before them, a queen surveying the ruins of her enemy's kingdom. "I did. You wanted to talk about legacy. Victoria, truth, integrity. This is what that looks like. You tried to erase my future, so I decided to expose your past." "You will be ruined for this," Victoria shrieked, her carefully constructed composure finally shattering. "No," Avery said softly. "You're already ruined. You just haven't realized it yet. You built your house on a foundation of lies. I built mine on the truth. Let's see which one is still standing in the morning." She turned her back on their shocked, hate-filled faces and walked away. People parted before her, their expressions a mixture of awe, fear, and respect. She had not only fought back against the most powerful family in town, she had in one brilliant, devastating move brought them to their knees. As she stepped out of the museum and into the cool night air, she took her first deep, truly free breath in years. Her driver pulled the car around. As she settled into the back seat, she placed a hand on her belly. The baby kicked a strong, reassuring flutter. The war wasn't over. There would be legal battles, SEC investigations, and social fallout. But the decisive battle had been fought and won. The Hemlock House was no longer a fortress. It was a home. And its owner, the woman they had tried to delete, was finally free to create her own portrait on her own terms, with no one left to erase her. Avery's story is a powerful reminder that our greatest strength is often forged in our deepest betrayals. She wasn't just fighting a cruel husband. She was fighting a corrupt system that tried to render her powerless and invisible. But by refusing to be a victim, she reclaimed her name, her future, and her identity, proving that the most formidable empire can be brought down by one person armed with the truth. What did you think of Avery's ultimate act of rebellion? Could you have done what she did? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. The glittering chandeliers of the Grand Oak Ballroom reflected in Victoria Sterling's champagne flute, but the sparkle couldn't reach the icy dread coiling in her stomach. Tonight was supposed to be a celebration of her husband Richard's latest triumph, a merger that would solidify his empire. But as Richard took the stage, his hand wasn't reaching for hers. It was entwined with a woman whose smile was as polished as the marble floors, a woman he introduced not as a colleague, not as a friend, but with 3 words that shattered Victoria's world: my new wife. Little did he know, while he was rewriting their life story, she was about to erase his name from every asset he owned. Victoria Sterling had long been the epitome of quiet elegance, a woman who moved through the gilded circles of New York high society with an understated grace that many mistook for fragility. She was the perfect wife for a man like Richard Sterling, a real estate magnate whose ambition was as towering as the skyscrapers that bore his name. Theirs was a life curated for magazine spreads, a sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue with panoramic views of Central Park summers in the Hamptons, and a collection of art that could rival a small museum. To the outside world, they were a power couple, a testament to having it all. But Victoria knew the truth. Their life, once a vibrant tapestry of shared dreams and passionate nights, had faded into a carefully orchestrated performance. The laughter no longer reached Richard's eyes, and his touch, when it came, felt more like a formality than an act of affection. She had first noticed the change about a year ago. It was subtle at first. Late nights at the office he claimed were due to a demanding new project, a sudden obsession with his phone that he'd angle away from her, the faint, unfamiliar scent of perfume on his collar that he'd brush off as a chance encounter with an overzealous client. Victoria, ever the pragmatist, had tried to address it. She suggested counseling, a vacation, anything to bridge the chasm that was silently growing between them. Richard had dismissed her concerns with a wave of his hand, attributing her worries to pregnancy hormones. Yes, Victoria was pregnant. 7 months along with the child they had both so desperately wanted a child, she had thought would be the glue to mend the cracks in their marriage. Now the gentle kicks in her womb felt less like a promise of new life and more like a countdown to an impending storm. Tonight was the annual Sterling Enterprises Gala, a lavish affair to celebrate the successful merger with a rival firm. It was the culmination of a year of relentless work for Richard, a deal that would cement his legacy. Victoria had spent the afternoon in a flurry of preparations, her personal stylist fussing over the deep sapphire gown that cascaded over her baby bump, a team of hair and makeup artists sculpting her into the perfect image of a billionaire's wife. But beneath the layers of silk and diamonds, a sense of unease gnawed at her. Richard had been unusually distant all week, his conversations clipped and his eyes holding a secret she couldn't decipher. As she stood before the full-length mirror, her hand resting protectively on her stomach, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was adorning herself for a sacrifice. The woman staring back at her was beautiful, poised, and utterly alone. The drive to the Grand Oak Ballroom was silent, the tension in the back of the Rolls-Royce so thick she could have cut it with the diamond-encrusted knife she'd received as a wedding present. Richard was engrossed in his phone, a small, tight smile playing on his lips as he typed. He didn't notice the way her hands trembled in her lap, or the way her gaze lingered on his profile, searching for a flicker of the man she had married. The ballroom was a sea of familiar faces. Business partners, rivals, and the city's elite, all swathed in couture and dripping with jewels. The air buzzed with a mixture of genuine admiration and thinly veiled envy for the man of the hour. As they entered, a wave of photographers descended upon them, their flashes like a barrage of tiny explosions. Richard, ever the showman, pulled her closer, his arm a possessive weight around her shoulders, a smile plastered on his face for the cameras. It was a well-rehearsed pose, one they had perfected over the years. But tonight it felt like a betrayal. Throughout the cocktail hour, Victoria played her part with an Oscar-worthy performance. She smiled, she mingled, she accepted congratulations on Richard's success and well wishes for their impending arrival. But her eyes kept drifting back to Richard, who was holding court at the center of the room. He was in his element, a king in his castle, and she was just another one of his prized possessions on display. It was during dinner that the first tremor of the earthquake to come made itself felt. Victoria was seated at the head table, a carefully curated collection of the city's most influential figures. The conversation was a predictable blend of market trends and summer travel plans. She was picking at her deconstructed Caesar salad when a woman approached their table. She was stunning in that overtly sensual way that was the antithesis of Victoria's classic beauty. Her dress was a fiery red, clinging to a figure that was all curves and confidence. Her dark hair was styled in loose cascading waves, and her eyes, the color of warm whiskey, were fixed on Richard. "Richard, darling," she purred, her voice a low, seductive drawl that seemed to silence the surrounding chatter. Victoria watched as Richard's face, which had been a mask of cool professionalism, broke into a genuine, unguarded smile. It was a smile she hadn't seen directed at her in years. "Isabella," he said, his voice laced with an intimacy that sent a fresh wave of ice through Victoria's veins. He stood, his hand lingering at the small of Isabella's back as he introduced her to the table. "Everyone, this is Isabella Rossi, our new head of international marketing. She was instrumental in the final stages of the merger." Isabella's eyes swept over the table, her gaze briefly flicking to Victoria's baby bump before meeting her eyes. There was a flicker of something in their depths, triumph, pity, or perhaps a mixture of both. "It's a pleasure to finally meet you all," she said, her smile never quite reaching her eyes. Victoria's own smile felt frozen on her face. She extended a hand, her voice a cool, steady tone that betrayed none of the turmoil raging within her. "Welcome to the team, Ms. Rossi." The rest of the dinner passed in a blur. Victoria couldn't taste the seared scallops or the perfectly aged filet mignon. The lively conversation around her faded into a dull roar. The only thing she could focus on was the way Richard's attention kept drifting back to Isabella. The subtle glances, the shared smiles, the easy camaraderie that spoke of a history Victoria was not a part of. She felt a hand on her arm and turned to see her father, a retired judge with a sharp mind and an even sharper intuition, his brow furrowed with concern. "Are you all right, Victoria? You look pale." She forced a reassuring smile. "Just a little tired, Dad. This baby is taking all my energy." But her father's gaze was fixed on Richard, who was now laughing at something Isabella had whispered in his ear. When he looked back at Victoria, his expression was grim. He knew just as she did that this was more than just a passing flirtation. This was a paradigm shift, a tectonic plate moving beneath the foundations of their lives. As the dessert plates were cleared and the waiters began to pour the celebratory champagne, Richard stood tapping his glass for attention. The room fell silent, all eyes on the man at the podium. Victoria's heart began to pound a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She had a premonition, a cold, sickening certainty that what he was about to say would change everything. He began with the usual platitudes, thanking his team, his partners, the board of directors. He spoke of the future of expansion of a new era for Sterling Enterprises. And then he paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed not on Victoria, but on Isabella. "This merger is not the only new chapter in my life," he began, his voice ringing with a conviction that made Victoria's blood run cold. He beckoned for Isabella to join him on the stage. She moved with the fluid grace of a predator, her red dress a slash of color against the dark suits and muted tones of the room. Richard took her hand, his thumb stroking the back of it as he turned to face the stunned audience. "As many of you know, my personal life has been in a state of transition." He glanced briefly, almost dismissively, in Victoria's direction. "Victoria and I have been separated for some time now." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Victoria felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie, a bald-faced, audacious lie. They lived in the same house, slept in the same bed, were expecting a child together. But Richard wasn't finished. He raised Isabella's hand to his lips, his eyes never leaving hers. "And so it is with immense joy that I introduce to you the future of Sterling Enterprises and the future of my life." He paused for dramatic effect, his voice dropping to a theatrical whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "My new wife, Isabella Sterling." The world tilted on its axis. The chandeliers seemed to sway, the chatter of the room dissolving into a deafening roar in Victoria's ears. She saw the flash of a diamond ring on Isabella's finger, a gaudy, ostentatious thing that was so unlike the classic elegance of the ring Richard had given her. She saw the triumphant smirk on Isabella's face, the smug satisfaction in her eyes, and she saw the cold, unapologetic finality in Richard's. He hadn't just been having an affair. He had been living a double life. He had replaced her not just in his bed, but in his entire world. And he had chosen to announce it in the most public, most humiliating way possible. In that moment, something inside Victoria snapped. The hurt, the betrayal, the humiliation, it all coalesced into a single white-hot point of rage. The fragile, graceful facade she had so carefully maintained for years shattered, and in its place was a woman of steel. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply rose to her feet, her movements slow and deliberate, a queen surveying the ruins of her kingdom. She met Richard's gaze across the crowded room, and for the first time in a long time, she saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He had mistaken her quietness for weakness, her grace for submission. He had made a fatal miscalculation. As the first shocked whispers began to ripple through the ballroom, Victoria turned and walked away, her head held high. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. The war had just been declared, and she was already planning her first move. He had introduced his mistress as his new wife. Tomorrow his pregnant and soon-to-be ex-wife would freeze his assets, and then she would dismantle his empire piece by piece. The walk out of the Grand Oak Ballroom was the longest of Victoria's life. Every step was a battle against the tidal wave of emotions threatening to consume her. The shocked faces of their friends and colleagues blurred into a kaleidoscope of pity and morbid curiosity. She could feel their eyes on her back, their whispers like 1,000 tiny needles pricking at her skin. But she didn't falter. Her spine remained ramrod straight, her chin held at an angle of defiance. She was a sterling, and she would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her crumble. The moment the heavy oak doors of the ballroom closed behind her, cutting off the cacophony of her public humiliation, her composure fractured. A single ragged sob escaped her lips, a sound of such raw anguish that it seemed to echo in the cavernous, empty hallway. She leaned against the cool marble wall, her hand pressed against her stomach as if to shield her unborn child from the shrapnel of his father's betrayal. Her driver, a kind elderly man named Arthur, who had been with her family for years, rushed to her side, his face etched with concern. "Mrs. Sterling, are you all right?" Victoria couldn't bring herself to speak. She simply nodded, a gesture that was more of a tremor than a confirmation. Arthur, with a discretion born of long years of service to the wealthy and their often dramatic lives, simply opened the door to the waiting Rolls-Royce and helped her inside. The drive back to the Park Avenue penthouse was a blur of city lights and silent tears. The glittering skyline that had once been a symbol of her and Richard's shared ambition now seemed to mock her, a constant reminder of the life that had been so cruelly snatched away. When she arrived, the apartment felt cavernous and cold, a mausoleum of broken promises. The photographs on the walls, a curated collection of their happiest moments, now felt like a cruel joke. There was a photo of them on their wedding day, Richard's eyes alight with what she had thought was love. Another of them in St. Bart's, their skin tanned and their smiles carefree. And the most recent one, a professional shot from a few months ago, her baby bump just beginning to show Richard's hand resting protectively on it. A lie. It was all a lie. With a surge of fury, she ripped the photo from the wall, the sound of shattering glass a satisfying counterpoint to the shattering of her heart. One by one, she tore down the images of their life together until the walls were bare and the floor was littered with the fragments of their shared past. Exhausted and emotionally drained, she sank onto the plush white sofa, the silence of the apartment pressing in on her. The rage that had sustained her had given way to a profound, bone-deep sorrow. How could she have been so blind? The signs had all been there, the late nights, the secret phone calls, the emotional distance. She had chosen to ignore them, to believe in the fantasy she had so desperately wanted to be real. She thought of the baby, her son, and a fresh wave of grief washed over her. He would be born into a broken home, a pawn in a war he had no part in starting. But as she cradled her belly, a new resolve began to take root in the barren landscape of her heart. She would not let Richard destroy their son's life as he had destroyed hers. She would fight not just for herself, but for her child. She picked up her phone, her fingers trembling as she scrolled through her contacts. There was only one person she could call, one person she knew would understand the intricacies of the world she was about to go to war with. The phone rang twice before a crisp, no-nonsense voice answered. "Victoria." "It's past midnight. Is everything all right?" It was her father, Judge Robert Vance, a man whose reputation for integrity and sharp legal acumen was legendary in New York legal circles. He had retired from the bench 5 years ago, but his mind was as sharp as ever. "Dad." Victoria's voice broke. "I need you." Without hesitation, he replied, "I'm on my way." An hour later, her father was sitting opposite her, a tumbler of whiskey in his hand, his face a grim mask as she recounted the events of the evening. She left nothing out, from the subtle signs of Richard's affair to the public brutal announcement of his new wife. When she had finished, the only sound in the room was the gentle clinking of ice in her father's glass. He took a long, slow sip before speaking, his voice calm and measured. "The man is a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool." He leaned forward, his eyes the same shade of deep blue as hers, locking onto her own. "But he has made a critical error. He has underestimated you, and that, my dear, is where we have the advantage." He set his glass down on the polished mahogany coffee table, the sound a sharp, decisive rap. First thing in the morning we call my lawyer. Not your and Richard's lawyer, not a family lawyer. My lawyer, a shark. We're going to hit him where it hurts Victoria. We're going to go after his money. A flicker of the old Victoria, the woman who had once been a sharp, ambitious corporate lawyer herself before giving it up to be Richard's wife, sparked in her eyes. But how all our assets are in joint accounts in trusts. He has a team of the best financial advisors in the country. Her father smiled a cold, predatory smile that she had seen him use on the bench to intimidate cocky young lawyers. He may have a team of advisors, but we have something better. We have the truth, and we have the element of surprise. He stood and began to pace the room, his mind already working, formulating a strategy. He's arrogant. He believes he's untouchable. He won't be expecting a fight. He'll be expecting you to fall apart, to retreat, to negotiate a quiet, dignified divorce. We will do none of those things. He stopped in front of her, his hand resting on her shoulder. We will be ruthless. We will be relentless. And we will win. For the first time since she had walked out of that ballroom, Victoria felt a glimmer of hope. She was not alone in this fight. She had her father, a man who had never lost a battle in his life, and she had a new, steely resolve. Richard had started a war. She was going to finish it. The next morning, Victoria woke with a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. The grief was still there, a dull ache in her chest, but it was now overlaid with a cold, clear anger. She dressed not in one of her usual flowing feminine dresses, but in a sharply tailored pantsuit, the kind she used to wear when she was a lawyer. It was a suit of armor, a statement of intent. She met her father in his study, a room lined with leather-bound law books and filled with the scent of old paper and wood smoke. Standing beside him was a woman in her late 40s, her hair cut in a severe no-nonsense bob, her eyes sharp and intelligent. Victoria, this is Evelyn Reed, her father said, the best divorce lawyer in New York, and for the next few months your new best friend. Evelyn Reed shook her hand, her grip firm and her gaze direct. Mrs. Sterling, I've read the prenuptial agreement you sent over last night. It's comprehensive. Victoria nodded. The prenup had been Richard's idea, a standard precaution for a man of his wealth. She had signed it without a second thought, blinded by love and the belief that it would never be anything more than a piece of paper in a file. It is, Victoria agreed, but it was signed under the assumption of a faithful and honest marriage. Richard has violated both of those conditions. Evelyn's lips curved into a faint smile. Indeed, he has. And his very public, very humiliating declaration of a new marriage, while still legally married to you, and with you carrying his child, is a gift. A very, very expensive gift. She opened her briefcase and pulled out a stack of documents. We need to move quickly before he has a chance to hide his assets. We'll file for an immediate injunction, a temporary restraining order that will freeze all joint accounts, trusts, and credit lines. We'll also put a lien on all his properties, both personal and commercial. Victoria's eyes widened. Is that possible? It is when you have a husband who has so flagrantly and publicly committed adultery and emotional distress. Evelyn said, her voice laced with the confidence of a woman who knew she was at the top of her game. We'll argue that he is a flight risk, that he may try to move his assets offshore to protect them from the divorce settlement. Given his impulsive behavior, it's not an unreasonable argument. She slid a document across the table to Victoria. This is the petition. I need you to read it carefully and then sign it. Victoria picked up the pen, her hand steady. She read through the legal jargon, the cold, formal language, a stark contrast to the hot, messy emotions of the past 24 hours. But as she read, she felt a sense of power. She was no longer a victim. She was a woman taking control of her life. She signed her name with a firm, decisive stroke. Good, Evelyn said, taking the document back. I'll have this filed within the hour. By lunchtime, Richard Sterling will find himself a very rich man with no access to his money. A small, grim smile touched Victoria's lips. The war had begun. and she had just fired the first shot. The news of the injunction hit Richard Sterling like a physical blow. He was in a board meeting basking in the afterglow of his successful merger and his bold public declaration of his new life with Isabella. He was feeling invincible on top of the world. And then his phone buzzed a frantic text from his personal banker. "All your accounts have been frozen. Call me immediately." Richard excused himself from the meeting, a knot of confusion and irritation tightening in his stomach. He dialed his banker, his voice sharp with impatience. "What the hell is going on? I have a multi-million-dollar deal closing this afternoon." The banker's voice was strained apologetic. "I'm sorry, Richard. We received a court order this morning. A temporary restraining order. All your personal and business assets are frozen pending a court hearing." Richard's blood ran cold. "On what grounds a petition filed by your wife, Victoria Sterling?" The name hung in the air, a testament to his own monumental stupidity. Victoria. He had dismissed her, disregarded her, humiliated her. He had expected her to crumble, to retreat into her grief and accept a quiet, generous settlement. He had not expected this. He had not expected her to fight back. He ended the call, his hands trembling with a rage so intense it was almost blinding. He stormed back into the boardroom, his face a thunderous mask. "The meeting is over," he snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl. He turned to his personal assistant. "Get Evelyn Reed on the phone. Now." He knew the name. Evelyn Reed was a shark, a pit bull in a designer suit. The fact that Victoria had hired her was a clear declaration of war. He spent the next hour on the phone with his own team of lawyers, their voices a panicked chorus of disbelief and damage control. The injunction was ironclad. Victoria had timed it perfectly, hitting him at his most vulnerable right after his public display of arrogance. The judge, no doubt influenced by Victoria's father's reputation and the sheer audacity of Richard's actions, had granted the order without hesitation. He was, for all intents and purposes, a billionaire with no cash. His credit cards were declined. His lines of credit were suspended. The deal he was supposed to close that afternoon was now in jeopardy. His fury, which had been a simmering volcano, finally erupted. He swept his arm across his mahogany desk, sending a cascade of papers, a laptop, and a half-empty coffee cup crashing to the floor. He let out a roar of pure, unadulterated rage, a sound that echoed through the hushed, terrified halls of Sterling Enterprises. He had built this empire from the ground up. He had clawed his way to the top of a ruthless, unforgiving industry. He would not be brought down by a woman he had so carelessly cast aside. He grabbed his phone and dialed Victoria's number. It went straight to voicemail. He tried again and again, each unanswered call fueling his rage. He left a string of increasingly vitriolic messages, his voice raw with a mixture of threats and disbelief. "How dare you, Victoria? After everything I've given you, you'll regret this. I'll see you in court. I'll take everything. You'll be left with nothing. Do you hear me? Nothing." But his threats felt hollow even to his own ears. He had no power here. She had outmaneuvered him, outsmarted him. She had taken his greatest strength, his wealth, and turned it into his greatest weakness. Meanwhile, Victoria was in Evelyn Reed's office, a calm oasis of muted colors and quiet professionalism in the heart of the city. She had listened with a detached sense of vindication to the increasingly frantic messages from Richard. She felt no fear, only a cold, hard certainty that she had made the right decision. "He's panicking," Evelyn said, a small, satisfied smile on her lips. "And when people panic, they make mistakes." She slid a new set of documents across the table to Victoria. "This is a list of forensic accountants, the best in the business. We need to find out exactly what he's worth, where all his money is hidden. Richard is a smart man. He'll have offshore accounts, shell corporations, assets hidden in places we don't even know exist." Victoria nodded her mind, already shifting into the familiar analytical mode of her former legal career. "I can help with that. I may have been out of the game for a while, but I know how he thinks. I know the kinds of risks he's willing to take." She remembered conversations she had overheard, late-night phone calls she had pretended not to listen to, hushed meetings with men whose names she had committed to memory. She had a wealth of information, a roadmap to Richard's hidden empire that she had never realized she possessed. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of her own power, a power that had nothing to do with her husband's name or his money. It was her own intelligence, her own resilience, her own strength. The rest of the day was a whirlwind of meetings and phone calls. Victoria and Evelyn assembled their team, a formidable force of legal and financial experts. They worked with a quiet, focused intensity fueled by a shared sense of purpose and a righteous anger. That evening, as Victoria returned to the empty penthouse, she found a package waiting for her. It was from her father. Inside was a small velvet box. She opened it to find a single, exquisitely crafted gold key. Attached to it was a note written in her father's elegant, familiar script. For your new home, a new start. You are stronger than you know, Victoria. And you are not alone. The address was for a brownstone in the West Village, a beautiful historic building on a quiet, tree-lined street. A place that was hers and hers alone. She looked around the penthouse at the bare walls and the lingering ghosts of a life that was no longer hers. She felt a pang of sadness, a final fleeting moment of grief for the love she had thought was real. And then she turned and walked away, the gold key clutched in her hand. She was not just freezing his assets. She was freezing him out of her life. She was starting over, and she was ready for whatever came next. The fury of Richard was just beginning, but so was her own quiet, unyielding strength. The first court hearing was a spectacle. The media, having caught wind of the salacious details of the Sterling divorce, had descended upon the courthouse in a frenzy. The story had all the elements of a blockbuster drama: a billionaire tycoon, a scorned pregnant wife, and a beautiful, ambitious mistress. Victoria, flanked by her father and Evelyn Reed, moved through the throng of reporters with a quiet dignity that was in stark contrast to Richard's barely concealed rage. He arrived with Isabella on his arm, a move that was clearly intended to be a show of defiance but which only served to make him look arrogant and foolish in the eyes of the judge. The courtroom was tense, the air thick with animosity. Victoria avoided looking at Richard, focusing instead on the calm, steady presence of her father beside her. She could feel Richard's eyes on her, a burning glare of anger and betrayal. But she refused to give him the satisfaction of a reaction. Evelyn Reed was brilliant. She laid out their case with a cool, methodical precision, presenting the evidence of Richard's public humiliation of Victoria, his flagrant adultery, and the potential for him to hide his assets. She painted a picture of a man who was reckless, impulsive, and untrustworthy. Richard's lawyer, a high-priced corporate attorney who was clearly out of his depth in the messy world of divorce court, blustered and objected, but his arguments were weak and unconvincing. The judge, a stern, no-nonsense woman with a reputation for being tough on arrogant husbands, was clearly not impressed. She upheld the injunction, extending it for another 30 days. She also granted Victoria exclusive use of the Park Avenue penthouse, a move that sent a fresh wave of fury across Richard's face. And in a final crushing blow, she ordered Richard to pay Victoria's legal fees and a substantial monthly sum for living expenses. Richard stormed out of the courtroom, his face a mask of thunderous rage. Isabella, her own face pale and strained, hurried after him. Victoria watched them go, a small grim sense of satisfaction settling in her heart. It was a small victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. In the weeks that followed, Victoria and her team of forensic accountants began the painstaking process of unraveling Richard's complex financial empire. It was a labyrinth of shell corporations, offshore accounts, and cleverly hidden assets. But Victoria had been a better student of her husband's business dealings than he had ever realized. She remembered names he had mentioned in passing, fragments of conversations she had overheard, details she had filed away in the back of her mind without even realizing it. She worked tirelessly, poring over documents, following money trails, connecting dots that no one else could see. And as she dug deeper, she began to uncover a pattern of deception that went far beyond infidelity. Richard hadn't just been cheating on her. He had been cheating his partners, his investors, and the IRS. He had been skimming profits, laundering money, and engaging in a host of illegal activities that could not only destroy his business, but could also land him in prison. The revelation was a shock, but it also solidified her resolve. This was no longer just about a divorce. It was about justice. It was about exposing Richard for the corrupt, amoral man he truly was. One evening, as she was working late in her new West Village brownstone, a place that was quickly becoming her sanctuary, her private investigator called. He had been looking into Isabella Rossi's background, and he had found something interesting. Isabella Rossi is not her real name, he said, his voice low and conspiratorial. Her name is Isabella Delgado, and she has a history, a long history of attaching herself to wealthy, powerful men and then disappearing with a sizable chunk of their fortunes. He sent Victoria a file, a collection of articles, police reports, and court documents. It was a sordid tale of seduction, betrayal, and financial ruin. Isabella was a professional, a black widow who had left a trail of broken men and empty bank accounts in her wake. Victoria's blood ran cold. Richard hadn't just been having an affair with a beautiful, ambitious woman. He had been ensnared by a predator, a con artist who was likely playing a long game of her own. A new terrifying thought occurred to her. Was Isabella working alone? Or was she part of a larger scheme? Was Richard a victim in all of this as well as a perpetrator? The question hung in the air, a chilling possibility that changed the entire dynamic of the game. Victoria realized that this was no longer a two-player battle. There was a third player, a shadowy figure whose motives and endgame were a complete mystery. She looked at the file on her computer screen, at the smiling, beautiful face of Isabella Delgado, and for the first time she felt a flicker of something akin to pity for her husband. He had been a fool, a cruel, arrogant fool. But he had also been a pawn in a much more dangerous game than he had ever imagined. And Victoria, in her quest for justice, had just stumbled into the middle of it. The stakes had just been raised, and the danger was no longer just financial. It was personal, and it was deadly. The next day, Victoria received a package. There was no return address. Inside, nestled in a bed of tissue paper, was a single perfect white rose, and a note written in elegant looping script. "Be careful, Victoria. You're not the only one who wants to see Richard Sterling fall." The message was clear. She had an anonymous ally, someone who was watching from the shadows, someone who knew more about Richard and Isabella than she did. But who was it? A disgruntled business partner, a former victim of Isabella's, or someone else entirely? The mystery deepened, and the danger intensified. Victoria knew that she was walking a tightrope with Richard's rage on one side and a shadowy, unknown entity on the other. But she also knew that she couldn't back down. She had come too far. She had to see this through, not just for herself and her son, but for all the other people Richard and Isabella had harmed. She placed the white rose in a vase on her desk, a symbol of the strange, dangerous alliance she had unwittingly formed. The game was afoot, and she was ready to play. She was no longer just a scorned wife seeking revenge. She was a woman on a mission, a warrior fighting for truth and justice in a world of lies and deceit. And she would not rest until she had uncovered the whole ugly truth, no matter the cost. The single white rose sat on Victoria's desk, a beautiful but unsettling symbol. Its cryptic message, "Be careful, Victoria, you're not the only one who wants to see Richard Sterling fall," was a constant reminder that she was navigating a battlefield with more players than she could see. This was no longer just a divorce. It was a conspiracy, and she was caught in the middle, uncertain of who was friend or foe. Her days became a disciplined routine of war room strategy sessions with Evelyn Reed and the forensic accountants. The woman who once planned galas now hunted for ghost corporations in offshore tax havens. Immersed in financial statements and legal documents, Victoria felt a dormant part of herself reawaken, the sharp, analytical mind of the corporate lawyer she had been before marrying Richard. She was rediscovering her own strength, a power independent of the Sterling name. While Victoria grew stronger, Richard was crumbling. The asset freeze had him in a chokehold, his business bleeding investors and his reputation in ruins. The strain was also fraying Isabella. Monitored by Victoria's investigator, the triumphant mistress had morphed into a tense, nervous figure, the pressure clearly mounting. They were trapped animals, and Victoria knew trapped animals were dangerous, but also predictable. The breakthrough came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in the form of a plain manila envelope with no return address. Inside was a single USB drive. No note, no rose, just a small black rectangle that promised answers. Her instincts, which had become her most trusted guide, told her this was a pivotal moment. She inserted the drive into her laptop, her heart pounding. A single password-protected folder appeared. On a hunch, she typed a name, Delgado. It opened. What she found was staggering. The drive contained a meticulously compiled dossier on Isabella Rossi, whose real name was Isabella Delgado. It detailed a sordid history of seducing wealthy, powerful men and then vanishing with their fortunes. But the truth was even more complex. The drive held copies of emails, text messages, and recorded phone calls between Isabella and a male collaborator. They spoke of Richard as the mark and the merger as the payday. Their plan was cold and clinical. Isabella would secure her position as the new Mrs. Sterling, and then together they would bleed Richard's empire dry. The most chilling revelation was that this collaborator wasn't just a partner in crime. He was Isabella's husband. They were a professional team of predators. As Victoria scrolled through the damning evidence, a familiar name in an email made her blood run cold. It was the name of the man who had been Richard's closest friend and business partner for over a decade, a man who had offered Victoria his deepest sympathies on the night of the gala. It was Marcus Thorne. The entire conspiracy snapped into place with sickening clarity. Marcus, eaten away by a secret jealousy of Richard's success, was the mastermind. He had fed Isabella the inside information needed to ensnare Richard. He had orchestrated the entire affair to shatter Richard personally and professionally. The white rose, the anonymous tips, it had all come from Marcus. He had been using Victoria as his own unwitting weapon, expecting her to be a predictable, grief-stricken wife whose legal actions would perfectly serve his own vengeful plot. He had made the same mistake Richard had. He had profoundly underestimated her. Leaning back, her mind reeling, Victoria saw the full chessboard. This was never just about Richard's infidelity. It was a multi-layered betrayal, and she had been cast as a pawn. But pawns, she thought with a surge of cold fury, can become queens. She would not be an instrument of Marcus Thorne's revenge. She would be the agent of his and Isabella's downfall. She picked up the phone, her hand steady and her purpose clear. "Dad," she said, her voice calm and resolute. "I know who our anonymous ally is. He isn't our ally at all. And I know exactly what we need to do." Victoria walked into Evelyn Reed's office the next morning not as a victim but as a strategist. She laid out the evidence from the USB drive detailing the entire sordid plot. Evelyn's professional composure was tinged with awe. "This is criminal," the lawyer stated. "Conspiracy, fraud, extortion. We take this to the district attorney." "We will," Victoria agreed, "but we're going to do it my way." "Hey." A plan was already forming in her mind, a trap not just for Isabella, but for the puppet master himself. She would turn their own conspiracy against them. The game had changed, and Victoria was about to make her move. The plan was a masterpiece of psychological warfare, as audacious as it was brilliant. It hinged on exploiting the very greed and arrogance that had driven her enemies. Victoria, guided by Evelyn and her father, was no longer just a participant in this war. She was its architect. The first move was to create an illusion, a ghost asset so tantalizing it would be impossible for Marcus and Isabella to ignore. Through a trusted media contact, a story was carefully leaked. It whispered of a secret offshore holding company in the Bahamas, an untouched reserve of Richard's wealth worth hundreds of millions, which he was now preparing to liquidate in his desperation. The asset was a complete fabrication, a phantom born in the strategy sessions in Evelyn Reed's office, but it was crafted to seem utterly real. As anticipated, the story ignited a firestorm in the financial world, and more importantly, landed squarely in the laps of Marcus Thorne and Isabella Rossi. Victoria's private investigator confirmed their frenzied reaction. They were circling the bait. To force their hand, Evelyn filed a new motion in court. It was a bold legal maneuver seeking to have Richard declared financially incompetent due to his erratic behavior and the undue influence of Isabella. The motion requested a court-appointed trustee to seize control of all Sterling assets to protect them. This was a direct threat to Marcus and Isabella's endgame. If a trustee stepped in, their phantom prize in the Bahamas would vanish into a legal quagmire. The clock was ticking. They had to make their move now. The trap was set. The call Victoria had been waiting for came on a stormy Thursday night. It was Richard, his voice stripped of its usual bravado, replaced by a raw, desperate edge. "Victoria, we need to talk," he began, the words strained. "It's about Isabella, about everything." Victoria's heart hammered against her ribs, but her voice was a steady, cool line in the storm. "I'm listening." He stumbled through a panicked story. Isabella had presented him with a lifeline, a way to get his money out and escape. She told him of the Bahamian company, a forgotten asset, and claimed she had a private investor ready to buy it for cash, no questions asked. Richard, desperate to reclaim any semblance of control, had almost agreed. But a sliver of doubt, a flicker of his old business acumen, had stopped him. He finally saw the predatory glint in Isabella's eyes for what it was. "I think she's playing me, Victoria," he whispered, his voice cracking with the admission. "I think she's been playing me all along." This was the critical moment. "She is, Richard," Victoria said, her voice softening with an unexpected wave of pity. "And she's not working alone." She laid out the entire conspiracy for him, Isabella's real identity, Marcus Thorne's deep-seated betrayal, the cold, calculated plan to utterly destroy him. A long, choked silence hung on the line, the sound of a man's world completely shattering. "What do I do?" he finally asked, his voice barely audible. "You do exactly what I tell you," she commanded, her tone now firm, authoritative. "You play your part. And for once, Richard, you trust me." The final act was staged at a discreet high-end club in Midtown, a bastion of old money and whispered deals. Richard, wearing a wire provided by the district attorney's office, was to meet Isabella and her investor to sign away the phantom company. Victoria was stationed in a surveillance van a block away, her eyes glued to the monitors that showed the drama unfolding, detectives from the NYPD's white-collar crime unit flanking her. She watched Richard enter, his performance as a broken, desperate man unnervingly convincing. Isabella, a vision in crimson, greeted him with a kiss that was pure venom. And then the investor arrived. It was Marcus Thorne, striding in with the unshakable confidence of a man who believes he has already won. The three of them sat, the air thick with deceit. Victoria listened, her breath held as Richard played his role to perfection, feigning hesitation and doubt, drawing his enemies deeper into the web. Finally, Marcus's patience wore thin. He dropped the pretense, his voice dripping with venomous pride, as he boasted of his master plan, of how he had orchestrated Richard's ruin from the start, mocking his friend's blindness and arrogance. Isabella joined in, her contempt palpable as she recounted her methods of manipulation. It was a full, damning confession broadcast directly to the detectives in the van. With the confession recorded, Victoria gave the signal. Just as Marcus slid the final document across the table for Richard's signature, the doors to the private room burst open. "NYPD," the detectives announced, their badges held high. "Marcus Thorne, Isabella Delgado, you are under arrest." The transformation on their faces was instantaneous and absolute. The smug triumph curdled into sheer primal terror. As they were led away in handcuffs, their expensive clothes suddenly looking like cheap costumes, Marcus's eyes locked onto a security camera. In that moment, he knew. He hadn't been defeated by Richard. He had been comprehensively outplayed and destroyed by the woman he had fatally underestimated. Victoria leaned back in her chair in the van, a long, slow breath of victory escaping her lips. It was over. She had won. Stepping out into the cool city night, she felt a profound sense of release. She had faced the architects of her misery, and using her own intellect and courage had brought their world crashing down. She was Victoria Vance Sterling, and she was finally indisputably free. In the aftermath of the arrests, the full scope of Marcus Thorne's and Isabella Delgado's deception was laid bare for the world to see. The story dominated the news cycle for weeks, a salacious tale of greed, betrayal, and high society intrigue. The trial was a media circus with every detail of the conspiracy dissected and analyzed in excruciating detail. Marcus and Isabella, faced with the overwhelming evidence against them, including their own recorded confessions, had no choice but to plead guilty. They were sentenced to lengthy prison terms, their glamorous lives reduced to the stark, sterile reality of a prison cell. For Richard, the reckoning was of a different kind. He had been a victim, but he was not an innocent one. His arrogance, his infidelity, his cruelty towards Victoria had all been the catalyst for his own downfall. He had lost his company, his reputation, and the respect of everyone who had ever mattered to him. The injunction on his assets was eventually lifted, but what remained was a fraction of his former fortune. He was a rich man, but he was no longer a king. He was humbled, broken, a man forced to confront the wreckage of his own making. He and Victoria finalized their divorce quietly, without the drama and acrimony that had defined the beginning of their separation. In the end, there was nothing left to fight over. On the day the divorce was finalized, Richard asked to see her one last time. They met in a small, neutral cafe a world away from the glamorous restaurants and exclusive clubs they had once frequented. He looked older, tired. The arrogance that had once been his defining characteristic was gone, replaced by a quiet, profound sadness. "I'm sorry, Victoria," he said, his voice raw with a sincerity she had never heard from him before. "For everything. For my cruelty. For my foolishness. For not appreciating the incredible woman I had by my side." He looked down at his hands, at the faint tan line where his wedding ring used to be. "You were always too good for me. I see that now." Victoria listened, a strange sense of peace settling over her. The anger, the bitterness, it had all dissipated, leaving behind a clean, quiet space. "I forgive you, Richard," she said, and she meant it. "Not for you, but for me. I can't carry that anger with me into my new life." She stood to leave, her hand resting for a moment on her now prominent baby bump. "I wish you well, Richard. I hope you find some peace." And with that she walked away, leaving him to his coffee and his regrets. It was the final definitive end to a chapter of her life that had been defined by him. A few weeks later, Victoria gave birth to a healthy, beautiful baby boy. She named him Nicholas after her grandfather, a man of quiet strength and unwavering integrity. She held him in her arms, his tiny fingers wrapped around hers, and felt a love so fierce, so profound, it eclipsed everything that had come before. He was her future, her hope, her reason for everything. She raised him in the West Village brownstone, a home filled with love, laughter, and the scent of baking bread, rather than the cold, sterile perfection of the Park Avenue penthouse. Her father was a constant, doting presence, a proud grandfather who delighted in spoiling his grandson. Victoria did not return to the world of corporate law. She had found a new calling. She used a portion of her divorce settlement to start a foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing legal and financial assistance to women who were victims of financial abuse and fraud. She became a champion for the voiceless, a warrior for the vulnerable. She used her own experience, her own hard-won wisdom to help other women reclaim their lives, their power, their sense of self. She was no longer Victoria Sterling, the billionaire's wife. She was Victoria Vance, a mother, a philanthropist, a woman who had taken the shattered pieces of her life and rebuilt them into something stronger, more beautiful, and infinitely more meaningful. One sunny afternoon, as she was pushing Nicholas in his stroller through Central Park, she saw a familiar figure in the distance. It was Richard sitting alone on a park bench, throwing breadcrumbs to the pigeons. He looked up and saw her, and for a moment, their eyes met across the green expanse of the park. He gave her a small, sad smile, a silent acknowledgement of all that had been lost and all that had been found. Victoria smiled back, a genuine, radiant smile of a woman who was at peace with her past and excited about her future. And then she turned and continued on her way, pushing her son towards the playground, towards the laughter and the sunshine, towards the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life that she had built for herself. The drama was over. The story was hers to write. And it was just beginning. The story of Victoria Sterling is a powerful reminder that the greatest strength is often forged in the deepest betrayal. She transformed from a scorned wife into a master of her own destiny, proving that with intelligence, courage, and a refusal to be a victim, you can not only survive the storm, but also learn to command the winds. Her journey from heartbreak to empowerment is a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. If you were captivated by Victoria's incredible story of revenge and rebirth, don't forget to like this video and share it with someone who loves a good tale of triumph.